The Second World War affected each and every country in Europe, let alone the world, and it's true that every country has their own story of the devastating events of 1939 and the 1940s themselves, but one country we hardly ever hear about is Spain. So in this video, I'd like to address what did Spain actually do in World War II. Now, for a very important thing for this is going to be the Spanish Civil War, to explain what happened in the Second World War, and as you can see, this ended just before the Second World War started, and the Spanish Civil War pit the Republicans against the fascists / the nationalists / the phalangists. Essentially, you had a very far left-wing coalition on one side and the very far right-wing coalition on the other side, and the right-wing coalition under Francisco Franco won the Spanish Civil War. And this is going to be very important for later on. Now, during the Spanish Civil War, the Germans, which at this point was Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler, they sent support for the nationalist side in Spain for Franco, but they covered this up and didn't make it too public. Very famously, they sent in the Condor Legion in Spanish, which is the Condor Legion, which bombed Guernica, and that's why we get Pablo Picasso's painting of the bombing of Guernica, which was a very symbolic town. Those people who did that, they weren't actually Spanish, they were the Germans, as the Germans were helping the nationalist Spanish in the war. However, the nations of Europe weren't convinced, and they knew really what was going on in Spain and who was helping who. So, after the Spanish Civil War was won by the nationalists, obviously they were then indebted to both Adolf Hitler of Nazi Germany and Benito Mussolini, who was the dictator of Italy at the time, who also sent help for the Spanish. Now, when World War II rolls around, the Nazis soon occupy most of Europe, and obviously Hitler is then wanting Francisco Franco to join in and to invade other areas. Now, of course, Spain is very useful for Hitler and the Germans because Spain obviously is very close to North Africa, and North Africa was one of the important theatres in the war, especially given that if the Americans were going to get involved, that's a possible landing area, and they did actually land there. And of course you had the British and the Free French fighting the Germans in the deserts of North Africa against Rommel, for example. But joining the war on Germany's side would be a big risk for Franco, as if things went badly for the Germans, then Francoist Spain could wave goodbye to its dictator. So in return for Spanish help with the Germans in the war, Franco asks for Morocco and Cameroon, but Cameroon used to be a German province, so Hitler refuses. Now, as well as this, Franco had the cheek to ask for the French Basque Country and French Catalonia to be added to Spain as well, but this belonged to Vichy France at the time, which was an ally or a vassal of Nazi Germany in the south of France, and Hitler was so enraged by this that he famously said to Benito Mussolini that he would rather have 3 or 4 teeth pulled than speak to that man again. Now, the Spanish did actually fight during the period of World War II, but they never actually joined the war. But they did invade the city of Tangier, which is it used to be an international zone in Morocco, but they did give this back at the end of the war. But they never declared war. However, they did send troops to go and fight in the war. Now, a very special division was called the División Azul, or Blaue Division in German, so the Blue Division. And this was essentially a company, a division of soldiers that was sent by Franco to fight on the Eastern Front against the Soviets, because he didn't want to anger the Western nations by having them fight in the West, so he sent them to the East to sort of bypass this. And they're actually quite a famous division, and they are the only ones who have been given a medal specifically designed for that division by Adolf Hitler. And the reason he did this was that in 1942, at the Battle of Krasny Bor, 6,000 of the Spanish division fought off 30,000 Soviets and ensured that the siege of Leningrad could go on for another year, and this is why they got the medal and where they earned their fame. Although they lost about 70 to 75% of their whole fighting force during this battle, so they were recalled to Spain. Although some refused to go, they then formed the Azul Legion, which is the Blue Legion, although they also returned to Spain in 1944. which is interesting. Now, I said obviously about the Spanish Civil War. Now, the Republicans, a lot of them fled into France, which is just across the border, after the end of the war. I believe it's something like 60,000, and a lot of these joined French regiments during the war, so the Free French, for example, and obviously then a lot of them wanted to keep their Spanish citizenship, so they joined the Foreign Legion, things like that, although I think you get your citizenship taken off you once you join the Foreign Legion, but a lot of them joined the Foreign Legion, and they then went off to fight, especially in North Africa, and later on the liberation of France as well. Now, as well as this, a lot of them joined the Maquis, and the Maquis were the Spaniards, the Republicans, who kept fighting after the end of the Civil War, sort of like the resistance, but then against Franco, and a lot of them also joined the French resistance and fought against the German occupation of France, and also in Spain and things like that. Now, another interesting regiment is the Régiment de Marche du Chad, which was active from 1943 up until today, but obviously 1943 until 1945 was the war years in which they were active, and this was a regiment that was made up predominantly of these Republicans who had come to France at the end of the war, and they were actually called the 2nd Armoured Division during the Second World War. And I was actually in Spain this summer, and while I was doing some shoppings, I was in a little shop and I overheard two Spanish people talking, having quite a heated conversation about the Civil War, and me, being the nosy Dutchman that I am, and wanting to practice my Spanish, of course, and to talk about the topic of history, decided to get involved in the conversation. And somewhere down the line, they actually told me that there was this legion at the end of the Spanish Civil War of Republicans, and that they were the first ones to enter Paris when it was liberated from the Germans in 1944. And while doing the research for this video, I actually found that this was absolutely true. The 2nd Armoured Division was predominantly Spanish Republican veterans, and they were the ones who first liberated Paris. So that's a fun little nugget of knowledge there. Now, of course, a lot of Jews decided to come to Spain to flee the Nazis, as well as other refugees from the occupied countries, especially France. Now, they weren't actually allowed to stay in Spain, although a lot of them went through Spain, because in Spain they knew they were a lot safer than Nazi Germany, and a lot of them went to obviously Portugal, or then on to America. And because Spanish people had this sort of special situation in Europe, that they were the allies of the Germans, but not actually involved in the war, they could get away with a lot more than other nationalities could. And actually a lot of Spanish people, I think in Hungary, helped thousands of Jewish people to escape the Holocaust, which is another interesting fact there. Now, as the war was coming to an end on the borders, Franco didn't completely trust the Germans or the Allies, so he always had troops on the border. But as the German troops in France changed to Allied troops, he sent a lot more of the army up, because there was a real possibility, he thought, that they might try to invade and then essentially topple all the fascist dictatorships in one go. But this didn't actually happen in the end, and he was promised by the Allies that they wouldn't invade because they had bigger fish to fry. Now, it's interesting that at the end of the war, actually, probably to pay for the Azul Legion, is that the Soviets did want to invade Spain straight away after Berlin fell, but the other Allies got in the way and made sure that this didn't happen. But it could have been interesting to see how that would go if they had actually done it. So, thank you very much for watching this video about the Spanish in the Second World War. I really hope you guys have enjoyed it. And remember, if you did, then I would really appreciate your thumbs up, and, you know, telling your friends that you enjoyed this video. Maybe they'll be interested, sharing it around. It really helps me out and the channel. If you'd like to know anything more, then please leave a comment, ask some questions. I'm sure there's loads of people who have a lot of opinions about this and whatnot, and I'd love to get in touch with some of you. So thanks very much for watching. I'm History with Hilbert, and I hope to see you all again soon.